This summit can help ensure that artificial intelligence charts a course that benefits humanity and bolsters our shared values.
Welcome to AI for Good, the leading action-oriented, global and inclusive United Nations platform on AI. Organized by ITU, in partnership with 40 UN sister organizations, and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of AI for Good is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and scale those solutions for global impact. In today's session, we're counting on you to use the live video wall feature to ask questions and post comments to help create an engaging discussion. We encourage you to stay until the end to chat, connect, ask questions, and network with our distinguished panelists and world-class AI experts in the neural network. It is now time to kick off the session and welcome our first speaker. The floor is yours.
Good day. We are proud and excited to announce the launch of a new AI for Good Discovery series on AI for biodiversity. This series represents a partnership between the International Telecommunication Union, the Convention on Biological Diversity, NatureServe, and the Alexander von Humboldt Institute of Colombia. My name is Maria Cecilia Londoño. I lead the research line on biodiversity indicators at the Alexander von Humboldt Institute, and I'm also the co-chair of GeoBond, a global network of experts on biodiversity observations and monitoring.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Gill, and I'm the director of NatureServe's Biodiversity Indicators program. And NatureServe is a science-based organization operating a North American-wide network for the conservation of at-risk species and ecosystems. And our Biodiversity Indicators program is the global arm of NatureServe, working with partners worldwide to establish robust biodiversity monitoring and reporting systems. And Maria and I are very excited to launch this series today, where we're going to be bringing together an amazing set of speakers, exploring the intersection between AI and biodiversity knowledge and conservation, and explore how AI is transforming the field of biodiversity.
Today marks the first of many sessions of this topic, and we are very grateful to have the Acting Executive Secretary of the Convention of Biological Diversity, Dr. David Cooper, here to launch the series with some opening remarks. David Cooper was previously the Deputy Executive Secretary leading the organization's strategic planning. With more than 30 years in environmental science, agricultural policy, and international negotiations, including 20 years at the CBD, he played a key role in the adoption of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. He has worked at the FAO, GRAIN, and more, and is a lead author of several editions of the Global Biodiversity Outlook and has contributed to this assessment. He has written numerous papers on biodiversity science and policy. With that, we hand it over to Dr. Cooper for some opening words.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Mike, and good day to all. It's a real pleasure to be with you today to launch this new series, AI for Biodiversity, together with the International Telecommunications Union, NatureServe, the Humboldt Institute, and GeoBond. As you know, last December here in Montreal, governments came together to adopt the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, with the aim of halting and reversing biodiversity loss by 2030. The framework comprises 4 goals for 2050 and 23 action targets for 2030. Among these are targets to protect 30% of the planet, to restore 30% of degraded areas, to bring the loss of areas of high biodiversity value close to zero, and to halt human-induced extinction of known threatened species. It's a framework for all, for the whole of government and the whole of society. It acknowledges the important roles and contributions of Indigenous peoples and local communities and states that their rights must be respected. Achieving agreement on this ambitious framework was, of course, a major success. But now the real hard work of implementation begins. Countries must translate the framework into national targets and plans to implement them, mobilize financial resources, and build capacity. A set of indicators has also been agreed to help monitor, assess, and report on progress towards the goals and targets. Each community, each country, and the international community will need tools to support these tasks. And artificial intelligence offers some impressive and exciting new tools. For example, AI is already being used to identify species and even individuals of species to support their protection and to enable biodiversity monitoring. To identify and diagnose the drivers of biodiversity loss, to map suitable areas for ecosystem restoration, and to prioritize sites for protected areas based on data on biodiversity, human pressures, and available finance. AI is also being used to help rangers keep wildlife under observation so they can protect it from illegal activities like poaching. These examples and many others are delivering some good results already, and we will hear more about this from Andrew in a moment. But they also raise some questions. For example, how can we ensure that AI doesn't lead to local knowledge and local views being cast aside in favor of global synthesis? How can we ensure that the optimization algorithms in prioritization don't undermine the interests and rights of stakeholders and rights holders? Clearly, it will require human intelligence to ensure that these new tools are used for good. We must ensure that the data that AI tools use is representative and of high quality, as we would with other tools, that misuse of data and misinformation is avoided, and that the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples over the use of their traditional knowledge is respected. We must ensure that AI tools enable decision-making by actors at all levels, including Indigenous peoples and local communities, and counter rather than accentuate existing power imbalances. And moreover, we know from experience that if data and the maps, models, and other information products generated from data are to be used by decision makers at national and local levels, they must be trusted, whether AI is used or not. And to facilitate that, national and local actors must be engaged from the beginning. The AI for Biodiversity series is a platform to exchange ideas and motivate creative solutions for the use of AI to support effective and timely actions to monitor biodiversity and to support its conservation and sustainable use. I hope also that this can be done in a fair and just way so that it really can be AI for good. With that, I welcome you to this series. I look forward to the exciting presentation we're about to have, and I wish you fruitful discussions. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cooper, for those inspiring and challenging remarks about how it's not just a matter of applying AI for conservation, but we have to be mindful of those power imbalances and how we bring that together. And as Dr. Cooper, as you mentioned, in December in Montreal, we've adopted this historic agreement for the conservation and restoration of biodiversity. And indeed, those 4 goals and those 23 targets are incredibly ambitious. And it really challenges us to come out of the gates running, hit implementation now. We have just a number of years to reach those 2030 targets. And we have to use all the tools available to meet those conservation targets. Now, AI, of course, is just one tool in our conservation toolkit. However, it's one that's really growing in leaps and bounds. not just at the programming level, but in the way that scientists and others are creatively applying it to tackle some of those challenges, as Dr. Cooper mentioned, whether it's identifying species or individuals, optimally allocating land use plans and conservation, and even how we actually manage effectively protected areas around the world. So we have an opportunity here to really use this series to explore how we can learn from others on how AI is being applied and how it could be applied to advance conservation around the world. And the AI for Good series as a whole is framed around exploring how AI can support the Sustainable Development Goals. And many will look at the Sustainable Development Goals as individual 17 goals, but of course they're very much interreliant and interconnected, and you cannot achieve one without the other. And in fact, as this diagram depicts, biodiversity in the biosphere fundamentally underpins all of the goals. We cannot achieve clean water goals, zero hunger goals, without restoring and conserving a robust and healthy biosphere. So in simple terms, conservation isn't just about nature, it's really fundamental to human health and well-being. And this series will really explore how we can strengthen our conservation approaches and accelerate them using AI as a particular tool. And of course, no surprise to anyone listening in, biodiversity is under decline. And there's many challenges around the transformation of the land and oceans by humans. We now see, I won't read all of these, but we now see at least 1 million species at risk of extinction in a short time period. And another example is that in my lifetime, I was born in 1970, we've lost 82% of the global wild mammal biomass, which is an incredible transformation of nature around the world. And AI is an opportunity to really bring some hope to this in terms of bringing together tools and innovations that we can use to actually accelerate conservation, whether it's around enforcement and surveillance of protected areas, better monitoring of various species around the planet to understand their status or trends, and so on and so forth. And with that, I will pass it over to Maria.
Well, in fact, biodiversity community has produced a lot of scientific works using AI for different applications. Since 2004, we see increase in the number of publications and exponentially increasing after 2006 and 17, with a total of more than 5,700 publications that address AI for biodiversity. So here's the graph, okay. And as conservation biologists, we would like to take a systematic and holistic approach to biodiversity and AI through this series. So we are using this framework from Christine and collaborators who reviewed the different applications of deep learning in ecology, and we have structured this series to cover a number of interrelated themes as seen here, moving from the individuals, identifications, to the landscape ecology, to global modeling. So we really hope that this series not only inspires you and celebrates the many achievements and innovations by our wonderful speakers, but also serves as a platform to accelerate the sharing and upscaling of creative solutions and ideas. And of course, we welcome all of you joining online from around the world via AI for Good neural network platforms. Welcome. So with that, we are incredibly excited to introduce the first speakers of our series, Dr. Andrew Gonzalez at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. Andrew is a professor and Liber Ero Chair in Biodiversity Conservation in the Department of Biology at McGill University. He has published more than 160 articles on the causes and consequences of biodiversity change and ecosystem sustainability. He has spoken widely on these topics, including at TEDx and the World Economic Forum in Davos. He is the founding director of the Quebec Center for Biodiversity Science and co-chair of the International Network the group on Earth Observations Biodiversity Observation Network, GEOBON. He is also the co-founder of Habitat, a company providing science, advice, and design principles for conserving and restoring biodiversity. So no one better than him to introduce this series today. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Maria. Let me just share my screen right here. Hopefully you see that now. Good. Thank you so much for this invitation to kick off this series on AI for good and its relationship to biodiversity. I wanted to give a very high-level presentation today which allows me to situate and emphasize the extraordinary role that artificial intelligence and all that implies has to offer in the field of biodiversity science, and in particular, the need to strengthen the role and the contribution of artificial intelligence methods with our traditional approaches and traditional methods for understanding why biodiversity is changing, where biodiversity is changing, and what can be done to mitigate those effects, but also to reverse the trends that we're seeing and that Mike alluded to just before in his opening remarks. So I'm very delighted to dive into this fascinating topic. And as I prepared for this talk, I've come to realize how fast moving this field really is. So it's a very exciting time to be involved in thinking about the linkages between AI and biodiversity change. So here we are, as David Cooper started at the beginning of, at the top of this session. Last December saw a landmark moment. We saw the Global Biodiversity Framework agreed and accepted by the parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity. We have 4 goals that should guide our actions to 2050 and 23 action targets designed to bend the curve of biodiversity. As is represented here, we have a few decades really to mainstream biodiversity into all elements of society and to harness our capacity to capture the data, the information, but most crucially, the insights we need to bend the curve. That is to support the application of biodiversity science, harnessing that knowledge that we generate into actionable change throughout all sectors of society. Now, crucial to the Global Biodiversity Framework is a monitoring framework. This is embedded within the text of the GBF, and it's designed to ensure that we monitor the state of nature, that we monitor the state of nature all over the world in our oceans and on land, and that we report our progress towards the targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Now, critically, the monitoring framework is not a passive thing. The monitoring framework is a framework for action. It's about guiding how we use information and insights to achieve the targets and the goals of the GBF. So what does that really entail? Well, it entails that the Global Biodiversity Framework is actually a theory of change. It's about how do we guide action according to our values, to the growing knowledge case that we have, and through repeated assessments of the state of nature to guide adaptive decisions for future generations, right? So it's an actionable, iterative process of guiding how we act for biodiversity, for people, throughout all aspects of society, but where data and insights that derive from data are being actively used to drive better outcomes. And of course, the challenge is that we have to think about these in different scales of space and time. We have to acknowledge that the system is changing over time. So as it responds to our actions, both positive and negative. And crucially, we have to think about the different dimensions of biological diversity, whether we're talking about threatened species hanging on in marginal ecosystems, to the management of ecosystem services and ensuring the delivery of those benefits that nature provides people, whether we're in an urban conurbation or living in rural populations. So it's an enormous task that data science and AI has an enormous role to contribute. So let me just cast this iterative adaptive process using a figure here. So the emphasis is on monitoring to guide action. And so we can think about the monitoring framework as simply tracking progress towards one or more of the goals of the global biodiversity framework. And over time, we're going to try to detect the change in biodiversity due to the drivers and also due to conservation action. And we can do that. That is historically what biodiversity science has contributed to the monitoring effort, that is understanding the state of nature. And as Mike pointed out at the beginning, the story is a little depressing because many of the trends, whether those measures are involve conventional science or traditional knowledge, suggest that many measures of biodiversity are in decline. So it can't be just about monitoring and tracking progress. It also has to be about how do we link action on drivers to outcomes for biodiversity. And that is essentially involving what we call attribution, where we associate a particular outcome, in particular an outcome for good, for bending the curve of biodiversity, to our knowledge of how change is happening in different ecosystems around the world. And then we use that attribution in conjunction with our knowledge of how things are changing, where we're detecting change, and using that to plan new actions and to inform leading indicators of progress towards the outcomes of any particular goal. And I focused here on goal A. And of course, as we do that, we implement these actions. So the new actions that derive from the detection attribution process are implemented. And as they're implemented at different spatial scales and over time, we expect to see improvements in the measures, the indicators that we're detecting. So this is the cycle that we, those of us working at the interface between biodiversity science and conservation, are trying to implement at different spatial scales and at different locations around the world. So a strong monitoring framework should guide countries and international collaboration to produce measurable and accountable action for biodiversity and people. That is the charge of the GBF, but it's a unique responsibility of the monitoring framework to get us there. And to get us there by 2030 in the first instance, according to the action targets, and ultimately to the vision of the GBF of living in harmony with nature by 2050. So my talk will have 4 unequal parts. I will spend some time on the first 2 parts really laying the groundwork. That is, what do we mean by monitoring biodiversity for action and why is it challenging? Secondly, I will describe what I mean by the detection and attribution framework for biodiversity. And then I will do a sort of a 30,000-foot survey of some of the exciting AI methods that are appearing now in the literature, and how I want to insist that they must be coupled to conventional scientific methods that are based on causal inference. And it's linking AI methods and data science to causal inference that will get us to a stronger detection attribution framework that will allow us to do this adaptive and iterative conservation science. And I'll close with just one slide at the end on linking planning and monitoring. So last December, whilst we were in the thick of the negotiations for the Global Biodiversity Framework, Maria Cecilia and I put out an editorial in Science where we wanted to raise 4 key issues that we think that data science and monitoring science can contribute to. We pointed to some major issues that may act as stumbling blocks for the monitoring framework. The first of these are enormous data inequities. That means these inequities that are among countries, among communities around the world, differential access to biodiversity data and to the models that we need to make inferences. The second issue is data sovereignty, right? Thinking about who owns their data, who has the right to use their data, and how to ensure that people who have their local knowledge, their regional knowledge, can act on it to guide their decisions at appropriate temporal and spatial scales, and ensuring that the right communities are engaged with the data to decision process. The third issue was accessible workflows for indicators. So this is sort of how do you go from data to decision? What is the steps in the analytical process from data gathering and observations through to modeling, through to inferences that the detection and attribution cycle requires us to do? And right now, relatively few parties to the convention, relatively few scientists in the world have ready access to these workflows. So we have to redouble our efforts to democratize the access to this science. And ultimately, this is why I think this summit is so important, and this series of talks on AI for good is so important, is that we need to strengthen our collaboration to achieve better outcomes vis-a-vis inequities, sovereignty, and ready access to the workflows. The first key challenge is that although there are now billions of observations of biodiversity in global data sets, such as the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, or the Ocean Biodiversity Information System, or in GenBank, there are literally billions of observations. But the unfortunate situation is that those observations are primarily aggregated in certain geographic areas of the world. And so there's an enormous spatial and temporal bias in where we have access to the raw data, the raw observations of nature, whether that's plants, animals, microbes. And this image here shows you the sort of the density of the dark dots and the yellow dots indicate where our observations are today. And you can sort of make out areas where we know we have a long history of collecting biological observations. But sadly, those observations cover just 7% of the world's surface at 5-kilometer resolution, and less than 1% for most taxa at higher spatial resolutions. So this is an enormous gap. It's not a gap in terms of the quantity of data, it's a gap in terms of the distribution and the availability of that information in our global repositories. So if we rely on global repositories to guide detection and attribution and to guide conservation action, then we're not going to start in an equitable way. We're going to run against this barrier of our capacity to mobilize these insights to guide action. So we have to overcome these issues. And crucially, we have to do it in a way that captures essential information, not only about the scales over which biological diversity is changing, from the local to the landscape, up to the regional, and on up to the global. We know from biodiversity science that the dynamics of extinction, colonization, invasion, population growth and outbreaks, and rates of adaptation happen differently at different spatial and temporal scales. So this is a challenge that I think that machine learning and AI methods can take on, but only if we are providing the appropriate predictors and the covariates that allow us to understand how biodiversity change at these different scales is being driven by drivers, whether that's urban transformation, agroecosystems and how we manage agricultural systems, to habitat loss on land and on our coastlines. And in every case, the challenge of the Global Biodiversity Framework is that there are clear targets linked to populations, to genetic diversity of those populations, to the threats of extinction, the risks of extinction, on up to the integrity and connectivity of our landscapes, and ultimately to the benefits that we receive from those ecosystems. So we have to get really good at detecting change at these different scales. Here in orange, it corresponds to my cartoon here of patterns of change in a measure of diversity through these essential biodiversity variables at the local scale, or in green here at much larger spatial scales, and on up to an aggregated global picture of how biodiversity is changing. So this is hardcore data science. This is how we mobilize raw observations of nature. We make inferences through models about how aggregate understanding of the distribution of change, whether it's increases or decreases, are shifting over time as we roll out the conservation measures to achieve the 2030 targets. So this is a huge challenge that the previous picture about the inequalities in access to data make it really acute and mean that we have to, if we want to get good at the detection attribution process, we have to resolve the data inequities. Here is one example where my research group tried to respond to an indicator of genetic diversity. Can we quantify the current state of genetic diversity change worldwide? And so to do that, we went to GenBank, where there are literally billions of, 1.7-ish billion observations of sequences, genetic sequences. And we were able to map where those sequences were found. And you can see here the height of the bar tells you how many sequences there are in that location. And what you see from this global map looks exactly like the previous map I showed you, where most of our information about genetic sequences lie are in the sort of usual places. Northern Hemisphere, Northwest Europe, Northeast US, some areas in South and Central America, a little bit in Indonesia and Oceania. So again, our ability in this particular study to quantify change in genetic diversity was highly geographically biased. And we struggled to get a clean signal of genetic diversity change because of these inherent disparities and where the data are and how we can access them. So it's an enormous resource, but we have to upscale our capacity to translate raw information, raw observations into inferences through the detection and attribution of genetic diversity change in this case. So how are we going to do this? Well, in this recent paper by Cavendish et al., the key message is that we need inclusive integration of these different methods: remote sensing, field-based ecology, and evolution, that together, when we combine remote observations and on-the-ground assessments of change, and this figure is a remarkable capture of the types of measurements that we can do through traditional methods, through new methods, through sensors deployed in nature, in the air, or from space. And it's the harnessing these multiple data types into this detection and attribution workflow that's going to be critical to breaking some of these barriers, these geographic disparities that I've been talking about for a little bit now. So here's a cartoon of what we need to do. So to situate you on this figure here, each dot would be, say, a different party to the convention. There could be 196 dots here showing you different countries around the world. And each country should have the capacity to calculate an indicator and the trends of the indicators over time. If we want to be able to detect improvement, we need to be able to do this easily and readily for all parties to the convention. And depending on the indicator, some areas may see increasing trends and other areas may see decreasing trends. And what we obtain is a cloud of points here that may be moving over time, depending upon the degree to which we are modifying human impacts shown on the x-axis here. And so it's our action on the human impacts that will raise or drop the points on this graph so that we're seeing increases or decreases in indicators of biodiversity, whether they're genetic, population, species, or ecosystem. And so the idea is that we can obtain this somewhat abstract distribution, this understanding of what the central tendency of the state of nature is worldwide. And that we can do today, as I just showed you in the previous analysis for genetic diversity. But ultimately, what we need to be doing is moving from 2023 here, where a business as usual scenario leads to continued declines in biodiversity, to a scenario where we're seeing a bending of the curve under a portfolio of socio and economic action through all sectors of society. So what does that imply? That implies that in the coming decades, we're able to, through a detection attribution process, guide conservation action to raise the average distribution of trends across the planet, so that we shift the distribution of our understanding of the trends, so that we're now in a net positive average rate of change, and that we're climbing this curve back up to reach the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. And this is an intense data, analytic, modeling, inferential prediction process. So this is how AI, I think, can combine with conventional approaches to science to give us this big picture of how we're doing vis-a-vis the vision, the goals, and the targets of the GBF. So by way of that, the challenge to our community, the biodiversity science community and the data science community, what do I mean by detection and attribution? So in climate science, the detection attribution framework has been alive and kicking for several decades now. And it's a big picture view of the Earth system. What we're trying to understand is how humans are modifying, humans shown here in this white circle, are modifying various aspects of the biosphere, our climate in particular, for example, through emissions of greenhouse gases. And can we then, through this causal arrow, detect and understand, attribute this driver, this cause here, to feedbacks on the human system, whether that's our economy or the health of our communities, also onto the natural system. How does climate change impact our ecosystems, for example? And that is the sort of the remit of detection attribution in climate science. We can also think about how the human system may cause deforestation, which may then have an effect on emissions, which has another consequence for the climate system. Today, what I'm talking about is detection attribution for biodiversity change per se. That is how the human system is driving change in different facets of biological diversity in the natural system, how that feeds back to impact humans through the nature's benefits to people, how that can in turn affect the climate system and feed back to us, and how it affects the stability and the resilience of the ecosystem processes that we rely upon, that global society relies upon. So it's focusing this lens, if you like, on these arrows directly from right to left and around. So when we think about detection attribution in climate science, we're typically mapping anomalies. For example, deviations from the tendency, the central tendency of the climate system. And we've known over the last century that through the remarkable relationship between data and observations in climate science to global climate models and regionally downscaled versions of those climate models, we know now what to expect and also what we're detecting in terms of those anomalies. And then here we're seeing this shift in the distribution of the variability in the climate system, the inherent variability of the climate system here in the Northern Hemisphere from the mid-20th century through to the early 21st century. You're seeing this shift to an average warming, in this case, of about 1 degree C in the Northern Hemisphere up to 2011. And then a similar, more noisy version for the United States. We do not have this kind of information. We do not have, in biodiversity science, we do not have access to this kind of relationship between observations and data science. And this is what I think we need to do. So detection attribution for biodiversity involves detecting change, understanding that change, and being able to make predictions about how biodiversity and ecosystems will change in light or as a result of the actions that will be realized under the global biodiversity framework. This involves a mainstreaming of our knowledge of biodiversity so that it can inform conservation and restoration efforts, can inform legal processes, can inform public communication about our progress towards the objectives of the GBF, but also our capacity to act on the drivers, which is at the heart of the 23 targets of the GBF. So the detection attribution framework brings together the process of observing biodiversity's change and the causes of that change so that we can act on them in a timely fashion. So here's a summary of that. On the left, we have human drivers and actions. In the center circle here, biodiversity state and change. This is sort of typically the remit of ecology, the field of ecology and environmental science over the last century or so. Over the last few decades, we've seen the extension into thinking about how biodiversity change influences natural and managed ecosystems, the biomass they produce, the nutrients they cycle, the carbon they fix, the decomposition in the soil, all of those benefits that we get, some of that change can be attributed to actions of humans on biodiversity. So in the detection attribution framework, we're doing driver attribution, impact and action attribution, and going all the way from the action on actions for conservation and how that can improve the state of biodiversity and ultimately the state of the ecosystems we rely upon. So this is sort of the remit of the detection attribution framework for biodiversity science. So what's at the heart of a detection attribution process? Well, it involves 5 key steps, and they're interlinked. It's an interlinked multi-step process that starts with causal models on the far left and our understanding and the insights we have about nature, through to guided observations where we monitor the state of nature and the state of people and the benefits that we get from ecosystems. So we had this guided observation and monitoring process. We use the best analytical tools to estimate change, to detect the signals of change, and then attribute the causes under the hypotheses and the inferences that we started out with here. And then through that, we grow confidence in our ability to attribute those causes via this iterative cycle around the detection attribution loop. So this is the crucial thing about this, is that this cannot be done with data alone. We must combine data science with causal inference science to guide the observation, estimation, detection, and attribution process. So when I talk about observation, in the community, in GeoBond's community in particular, we mean the process of recording elements of biodiversity using methods, state-of-the-art methods, whether that's remote sensing, environmental DNA, camera tracks, sound recordings of our soundscapes. We have a barrage of tools now that we can apply to accurately quantify the state of nature and how it's changing. And of course, we ascribe to fair and care principles to ensure that data respects the rights of people who've generated that understanding, how they share it, who they share it with, and whether that data is findable, accessible, and reusable and easily interpreted by humans and by machines. We mean, of course, the tricky statistical data science that requires estimating the state of nature when we only have a partial understanding, when we only partially observe the state of nature geographically and through time. And so when we do estimation, it's really important that we include measures of uncertainty and the degree of coverage that we have about that ecosystem, and that variable of that essential biodiversity variable that we use to describe the ecosystem and its state. What we mean by detection of change is demonstrating that an essential biodiversity variable or an indicator has changed in a well-defined statistical sense. That could be a trend in a regression. That could be something more complicated like a multivariate description of the state of nature. But in each case, we're providing a signal, we're estimating a signal, but we're not providing a reason for that change. But we must provide a clear statement of confidence about the rate and magnitude of that change. And then attribution, which is the process of evaluating the consistency of the detected change, the consistency of the response of that change we detect to the multiple causal factors that we think may be involved. So for example, the rate of local extinction of a species of plant might be due to multiple factors interacting at that location. Could be due to habitat loss, climate drying, local harvesting, grazing by ungulates. All of those factors may be part of our causal picture that we can use to attribute the change in the extinction rate of that local population, the extinction probability of that local population. And so it's that parsing of the understanding, the inference that we use, and assigning statistical confidence to those causal models. And it's when we link all of those steps into a single flow that we will have a principled, transparent, fair process that allow us to systematically report on progress towards the targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And so here's a sort of an icon or a cartoon representation of really what I've just said. So we are on the far left here, pulling upon more than a century of knowledge of how biodiversity responds to different predictors. Sometimes we're doing causal discovery. Sometimes we know the causes and we're doing strong causal inference to identify the different drivers and to hypothesize those drivers. We collect data informed by those models, filling these data cubes that may be in several dimensions, depending on whether we have information about time and space and other covariates, combining the full battery of observations that may be available to us, estimating those essential biodiversity variables, the sort of the statistics of those variables, the changes in the mean and the variance or the extremes of those variables, ensuring we have clear measures of error and uncertainty, combining that information into a trend assessment process with appropriate baselines and reference states. We know that many ecosystems are trending in a directional sense. So historical baselines might not be sufficient. We may also need reference ecosystem states to help us understand if the distribution is changing negatively or positively. And then finally, strong inference to understand whether the hypotheses at the beginning that encoded in these causal models are being realized in the data that we collect through this hypothesis-driven or causal inference-driven observation and monitoring. So the challenge is, can we break free of what's currently a very slow literature-based meta-analytic assessment process to something that's much more accelerated and in keeping with the 2030 targets and the 2050 vision? The challenge to the community is to move beyond research mode case studies and to develop monitoring systems and tools that can deliver rapid, reproducible assessments in the aftermath of notable ecological events, whether that's rising from land use change, some natural event, whatever the event is that's driving rapid loss and or recovery of biodiversity. Can we do it in the scale of weeks or months and not years? And that is what ultimately I'm hoping that we can do by bringing in AI methods into our traditional data science and inferential frameworks. So to summarize this section, we're introducing this detection attribution flow here that sort of cascades from the raw observations made by a biodiversity observation network or a BON. This understanding feeds robust models of biodiversity change that supply the indicators of progress on up to national and global assessments under the GBF, and or are being used to guide the calculation of leading indicators from predictive models that allow us to prioritize and plan our actions to bend the curve of biodiversity. And it's this iteration here that's going to incrementally allow us to achieve progress towards the GBF's vision. And we have to do that in a way that's smart, collecting understanding about how drivers are changing geographically over time. So now I just want to do a very quick overview, and I probably won't have time to dig too much in each of these. Think of it more like a sort of a quick show and tell of how I see AI, recent AI approaches applied to the detection attribution framework. So it's the advent of very large ecoinformatic databases that are allowing artificial intelligence methods to be applied. There's a long history of machine learning methods in ecology and evolution. Think about some of the regression tree approaches, these boosted regression tree approaches that are much more common in the machine learning applications in ecology and evolution that allow us to make good predictive models of various dimensions of biodiversity change. Those are well understood and being used on a regular basis. But increasingly now, as data sets become large enough, like the Global Biodiversity Information Facility's data sets, where we have literally access to millions of observations, now we open the door to neural network and deep learning approaches to fitting, for example, some of these models, but also using reinforcement learning processes or rapid classification of imagery or sounds that are coming from our monitoring networks. And I recommend this very recent publication here that does a beautiful review of machine learning and deep learning for ecologists that gives us sort of the big picture of where we're heading right now. Now, one of the key things I want to stress is that data alone is not sufficient. We need theory-guided data science. So if you look on this graph here, we can sort of use data, and data-only, data-driven models would fall in this lower quadrant here. And as we increase the amount of scientific knowledge we use, we can start to fill this area of the graph, which is sort of theory-informed data science. So the traditional theoretical models of ecology and evolution can be informed by the machine learning and the AI approaches that I just we showed on the previous slide, to create this hybrid approach, this hybrid strong inference with data science and prediction, using structured and unstructured data sets to achieve this happy optimum. So as this quote from this recent paper by Reichstein and colleagues in Nature, there is no doubt that modern machine learning methods greatly improve classification and prediction skills. This alone has great value. Yet beyond statistical prediction, the question is how data-driven approaches can improve fundamental scientific understanding, and I would add, to the detection and attribution process we need for biodiversity change. So this is the position I hold. I think is crucial that we identify and develop these hybrid approaches. And then another very recent paper points to the immense value of small data, that this can't just be about big data, right? Large, unstructured, millions, if not billions of observations, and that we are fitting very large models with thousands, if not millions of parameters to understand the patterns in those models. There's great value in the small data that was often coming from experiments or particular locations and observations where we have very strong inference, very strong understanding of what's happening. And so it's the combination of big and small data that'll help us understand the sort of the causal diagrams, the causal structures that we need for strong attribution. And so there's an important marriage to be done moving forward under an AI for good philosophy, where we are building upon the history of understanding that we had with process models and small data, and applying those to guide AI applications with large data sets. So under the causal step, we've seen the rapid development of the application of structural equation models, these sort of graphical representations of cause and effect, right? Where we can potentially learn a causal graph. We can discover a causal graph from using AI methods and understand how patterns of change in a variable are driven by natural forcing, climate, for example, anthropogenic drivers of different types, pesticides, exploitation, land use change, and come to what we call causal fingerprints, these sort of modules of causal inference that allow us to then test their transferability and our ability to understand change in different locations through this principled method of causal extraction, causal understanding. And once we have that model, can we combine it with other variables like ecosystem impact variables that we need if we want to understand the relationship between biodiversity change and ecosystem services? And then most recently, some remarkable approaches using recurrent neural networks, where we can learn the state of these causal, the structure, the weights of these causal graphs from the time series that we're collecting from our monitoring, and reinforcing our ability to predict these causal structures over time. That's a very exciting recent application for causal fingerprints and causal inference. New methods in causal discovery by text mining. This is a very recent effort to using a package in the R programming language called Causalize R that scans abstracts in the primary literature and looks for noun, verb, noun associations that allow us to understand whether some predictor is causing an increase or decrease in a particular element of the ecosystem. So here you're seeing a causal graph for how the factors changing soil nitrogen or reindeer population sizes. These are semantic causal knowledge graphs that can be extracted from the literature and can inform the causal discovery step. The observation process, this will be no secret to probably anybody on this call that observation of nature from space, from the air, using new sensors, allow us to populate these data cubes, these tables of presence and absence of different measures or different facets of biodiversity. And we've seen the advent of AI and classification learning systems to these very complex data sets that describe how biodiversity is changing geographically over space and time. So many of us will be familiar with these applications of convolutional neural networks that allow us to classify multiple species in an image, the state of the species here, whether they're blooming or not, whether an animal is in a different particular posture or not, and moving in a particular direction, identifying maybe its gender or its size, or in the case of microbes here, identifying microorganisms, maybe diatoms or protozoa. So obviously we're witnessing an explosion in the application of our capacity to classify objects in unstructured observational data sets. And this promises a fully automated approach to monitoring. And we're really excited about how we can combine new sensors with computer learning, machine learning, and vision packages to quickly identify change in the interactions among species, spatial distributions of species, their abundances and their traits over time. And it's these essential biodiversity variables that are heart of the estimation and detection process. The estimation step, we're seeing remarkable applications of data in GBIF combined with vegetation plot data. In this particular example, this is a long-standing surveys, hard-won vegetation surveys, combined with neural networks that build regression models that can predict the distribution of alpha, beta, and gamma diversity, or local diversity, regional heterogeneity and diversity, and country-wide measures of diversity in the case of Australia. And these methods are remarkable because they allow us to make predictions from the observations themselves and the covariates of human and natural predictors of the occurrences of those species. We don't need to go through this step of projecting a species distribution model. And crucial to the detection attribution cycle is that we get measures of uncertainty and areas where we have low certainty about the state of these different measures of diversity change over space and time. This is a paper that I was fortunate to be part of, where some students brought together the application of neural network approaches to understanding the network of interactions among species. Think, for example, about the interactions between pollinators and flowering plants that change over space and time. Can we deploy data science and AI methods and deep learning methods to create a geography, an understanding of how these interaction networks are changing over time? And it's harnessing traditional methods, traditional data sets with AI methods. Very exciting. Detection, can we detect change? In this particular example, these authors were able to detect and to project trends into the future for phylogenetic diversity, species diversity or native species diversity at very large, and here we're talking about the conterminous United States of America, combining observations from vegetation surveys, best models, regression predictor models, using AI approaches to understand and detect the signal of change across this very large area. Very exciting application to detection. And finally to attribution, where in this particular example is a paper that I was involved with, where we used extreme gradient boosting to learn how trees may be changing in space over time. So where tree diversity will change under the coming century, how species will redistribute under climate change, and using these learned regressions to predict the number of species extinctions, co-extinctions, and immigrations as they move around in response to shifting climates. And we're able to use that model, that neural network, that boosted regression tree approach to predict how biodiversity change under different scenarios, socioeconomic pathways, these 5 scenarios here, would lead to shifts in tree diversity under these different biomes. There's a very exciting study that allows us to talk about and make a prediction about how tree diversity productivity may change under climate change if climate change remains unabated out through to 2070. And so I promised this very last slide on planning and prioritization. And Maria pointed to this paper at the very outset of this session, where we've seeing now very recent examples of the application of reinforcement learning combined with models and covariate observations to iteratively improve where we should place protected areas to account for the spatio-temporal change in biodiversity driven by people and driven by natural, ecological, and evolutionary processes. And this particular example led to an application for Madagascar, where they're able to show under the new reinforcement learning model where we would prioritize protected areas in comparison to a more traditional approach using, for example, a tool like Marksan. And we can see that this particular reinforcement learning model met criteria with a greater success rate, did a better job at identifying where we need to place protected areas. And so I'm going to close here with my last slide with a call to the biodiversity conservation science community to get together, to collaborate, to break existing inequities, to work with countries, to harness an adaptive cycle of detection of biodiversity change, of attribution of those changes, both human drivers and conservation action, into a single framework where working with local communities, working with national institutes, working with local and national governments, the private sector, NGOs, we work together to guide biodiversity observations using latest technologies, of course, where AI plays a strong role in the identification of species, in a classification of species. We harness the kinds of models that I've shown you for causal inference, rapid prediction, AI-driven explanatory models that allow us to detect change geographically, detecting trends, attributing causes to those trends, and using that information to place protected areas optimally over time, and then use this understanding to create robust scenarios and forecasts of how we can bend the curve of biodiversity out to the coming century and inform policy and decisions over time. That is our task, that is our challenge under the monitoring framework of the GBF. And I thank you very, very much for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Andy, for a wonderful presentation. And this is what we hope to get, not just an overview of the opportunities of AI, but you really connected it through this detection and attribution cycle. And we have a number of questions coming through that Maria and I will direct to you live. But one that maybe connects all of this is, what you're presenting here isn't just the opportunities of AI for data collection, for modeling, for attribution, for planning, but linking it all into this virtuous circle, sequenced steps towards that. And like any sort of sequenced process approach, it only works if every piece works. So I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit on where in particular, the worst, if you want to call them the worst, bottlenecks are. Like, where should we put more effort in applying and advancing AI to really achieve the dream that you presented in terms of this detection and attribution system?
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, there are a number of bottlenecks. Some of them are quite simply to do with a certain level of literacy, understanding the opportunities of when fast emerging methods are relevant. For example, I discovered these reinforcement learning neural networks where these networks can be used to make predictions from time series. If I didn't know that existed, I wouldn't even think to apply it. Now, whether we can apply it depends on the availability of data. And they're data-hungry methods. So are there things that we can do as a community to bring together, for example, data sets of time series, very large data sets that allow us to exploit that kind of toolkit or that kind of tool set? Whether we can do that requires upstream, again, whether we can bring our community together to open data, to render the highest quality check processes to understand that we can that we have confidence in the data that we're using to make inferences. And some of that requires, in fact, it almost always requires working with the people who collected the data. And I'm a little bit worried about the disconnects between the human, the analytical tool, and the inferences we make. And they'll only be robust and they'll only be ethical and valuable and usable if we join all those up. So I think we need a little bit of we need the community to come together, maybe under the opportunity of the GBF, to develop the kind of open service, the open process that we see in our climate. I point to climate in part because they've achieved some of these, overcome some of these obstacles. But I think we're still a decade, we can't afford to be a decade away, but I believe if we go at our current pace, it's going to be a decade before we've really stitched together all these parts. So we need to put the foot on the accelerator there.
Yeah, no, that's spot on. Thanks, Andy. I mean, it's basically, in a nutshell, it's not just a technological challenge, it's a social, social challenge. Yeah, I'll pass it over to Maria to direct a question.
Yes, and well, this conversation goes very well with a question that we have in the neural network. So Aina Kale, she says the remote observations of birds have been solved more or less in Europe, but what is the situation in Asia or Africa? And then my question goes, well, if you have an answer for the situation and answer Anna anyway, how can the academic community, bridge this gap, narrow this gap, these inequities between the global north and the global south?
Great. I am not the person to answer the first question about whether we've solved the situation in Africa or Asia. Actually, Mike might have a better answer than I do. Yes, of course, remote sensing of birds, requires certain types of tags, certain types of our ability to follow where individuals are and where they're going. We're seeing the appearance of remarkable global databases like MoveBank that allow us to track the movement of birds and how they're changing habitats over time. I don't know enough to say whether we've solved it in Europe, but I suspect that, as we've seen from my presentation, that areas where these problems are solved are not representative of other parts of the world, and that there have been insufficient investment in these technologies in vast areas of the world. Your second question, I think, Maria, involves this link between the human, the network of partners that need to come together to as sort of a coalition of the willing, if you like, to orchestrate the not just the observations of biodiversity, but also the data science that follows from it. And so in GeoBON, as you know very well, we have something called a Biodiversity Observation Network, or a BON. This is a people and data science process brought together into a happy union where it's driven from a use and a need case. It's not a top-down process, it's a bottom-up process where countries can be in charge of their BON development process that meets the data needs and meets the science needs. So using my GeoBON cap here, I would call for support and funds made available to any country to stand up their BON, which allows them to deploy this detection and attribution workflows.
Thank you, Andrew. We have some other comments. Rodosla Kozmama, also regarding this difference in capacity of observations, and he talks about the role that other companies, not just the academic or the biodiversity community, has in this, but the other companies. Given your experience in consultancy outside the academic community, can you give us some more comments to this question, and then I will give the word to Mike for some other questions. But just first, because these two questions were related, I think we can discuss them a little bit here.
Thank you, Radoslav, and thank you to all the questions so far. Radoslav's point is excellent. He noticed that many of the examples I gave of applications of AI methods were for regions of the world where large data sets are present. No surprise there. These are data hungry, that require often using unstructured, but many variable, many observation data sets. And so, yeah, the flagship examples were from Australia or from the UK or from Northern Europe or the US. That cannot continue. it's all well and good showcasing the power of these methods for those areas. There's no doubt there are real conservation issues in those areas. But if we're going to democratize the access and use of that, we have to work with data holders in other nations, in other regions. And it's not because there isn't data in a global biodiversity information facility or a global data set that there isn't data available. As Maria invited me to do, I've worked through the private sector, and I've come to realize how much data is available and being held by private companies. In Quebec, it's hydro companies, for example, that do exhaustive surveys of the state of nature before and after a project. It's hard to obtain those data. So we have to work with large companies, work with local NGOs, but also build a sort of a trust-based relationship where public, private, research institutions come together to understand biodiversity change. And that takes a new level of understanding and commitment to working together, not just for the sake of the tools, but for the sake of the outcomes that come from in harnessing those tools. So what I found is that often we have locally available, quite large data sets that may not take us all the way to deploying a deep learning methodology, but certainly some of those other machine learning methodologies that we saw in the sort of that middle ground that can lead to very powerful explanatory models.
Great. Thanks, Andy. And there's lots of questions coming in, so we'll try and address as many. And we apologize if we don't get to everyone's question, but we've got one from Otto Brooks. Do you have any thoughts on where these data sets can be stored such that the scientific communities can readily access them?
Great question. I think we're witnessing a transition right now. So historically, what we've done is create very large repositories. And we've sent our data somewhere, and it sits in a bank of data, like GenBank is a good example for global sequence information. And those they have their strengths. That means that someone's responsible for curating that data, and that we all follow certain standards for sharing that information and using it. But the type of data that we're talking about is a mixed bag of qualitative, quantitative, Earth observations, ground truth. We're talking about a kind of a data lake rather than a data warehouse. And we're not talking about, I think, the next decade is not going to be about building ever bigger data repositories. It's going to be a peer-to-peer system. It's where people will be prepared to share access to their locally held data, and using sort of, web crawler type technologies where we can access via an API a local data set, calculate on the fly, and then centralize the calculation or the output of those calculations. So a good example of this is the ODIS, or the Ocean Data Information System, and the Ocean Hub, that is deploying exactly this technology for global ocean observations. And this community has been going now for a few years and has built this sort of peer-to-peer technology that allows the deployment of not only a sharing infrastructure, but also an analytical infrastructure that can sit on top of that. And so my particular perspective is that the world will have both global big data repositories, but increasingly a role for a high recognition of the need for local data sovereignty and trust around how and who we share our data to.
Thank you, Andrew. I think we might have a time for one more question. So I'm going to do this, to make this question by Juan Sebastian Cañas from Colombia also. So currently the applications of AI in remote sensing are based on the pattern recognition paradigms, like correlations mainly. So how to include causal structure in neural networks models for ecological inference, especially where there is no previous knowledge of these causal relationships?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. And of course, I am not an AI expert. But what my reading in the last few weeks, and I don't want to be too much of an imposter in this community, because I'm sure there are many AI experts listening here. But I showed an example, for example, with the recurrent neural network approach, where there is a causal discovery process happening from the time series. So there's sort of a node-to-node weighting, and the emergent neural network is adjusting and adapting based on the information that's streaming through time. So these sort of applications of machine learning to graph learning or graph discovery is kind of upstream of the detection attribution process. And there are methods. Unfortunately, these methods are somewhat data hungry, involve big data to be able to learn different causal networks, or these directed acyclic graphs that describe the relationships among variables and drivers. But this is why I made this point about the importance of small data and traditional knowledge of cause and effect, that these two things have to be brought together. The risk is that we run off and apply AI methods and data-only prediction, then we don't guide it by the theoretical and the causal knowledge that we have. So that paper that I pointed to, recently published in Trends in Ecology and Evolution, makes the plea for us to do those things together, and that we inform small, large data, deep learning, machine learning, but also classical inferential statistics that an ecologist or biodiversity scientist is often very familiar with. So Juan Cañas, I think you're quite right. Correlation is not causation, but sometimes correlation is underlying a causation, and it's only through our natural understanding of the history and the ecology of that system, combined with some of these new causal discovery methods and these sort of the causal inference frameworks of that we're seeing appearing in the machine learning niche, that they're going to get us there.
And maybe just one more, Andy, while we have time. And I think I can formulate this into a question, but this is really exciting. So we have somebody named Sahir Khan, who, and this alludes to what you're talking about in terms of how we can learn from other disciplines and sectors. So we do clearly have AI experts on the neural network platform right now. And so Sahir says, I'm an engineer with a background in aeronautics and applied mathematics. I've worked within the climate science, renewable energy, and Earth observation sectors. And I would love to discuss any opportunities where I could contribute to developing solution pipelines utilizing machine learning, AI, EO, and so on. So I wonder, Andy, if you can reflect on how we might not just learn from the climate sector, but how do we reach out and connect to experts that are applying AI and solutions in totally different fields than ours? Is there a way that we can create those communities that aren't just bonds within, interested people for biodiversity conservation science within a country, but can we start to grab those super smart people that are maybe working in aeronautics? Can they help us because they see a problem in a totally different angle that we never even thought of?
Yeah, what a great opening and an offer. So here, please contact me. Why? Because GeoBon, so this very large international network of experts in very different sectors of knowledge production related to biodiversity monitoring and change, whether that's data science, monitoring, the social dimensions of engagement, making inferences, has created something called knowledge hubs. So knowledge hubs are a forum or a way to bring different experts together to mobilize new knowledge. Right? They are end user centered. So the end use case, in this case, developing a detection attribution framework for conservation of biodiversity, could easily be populated by AI experts, mathematicians, modelers, on the ground biologists. And so we are setting up these knowledge hubs, one of which we have set up on indicators and another one we've just set up on modeling. And so here you are very welcome to join the GeoBon community and to be a part of bringing your expertise, that very valuable expertise that is not just theoretical. It sounds like you have very direct applied knowledge that we desperately need right now to respond to the SDGs, but also obviously the Global Biodiversity Framework's 2030 objectives.
Great. Thank you so much, Andy. And before we close, and there'll be a little bit of time on the neural network to network, but not much. But I just wanted to, again, thank you, Andy, for such a wonderful and inspiring presentation. And it really lays us up well. And for those listening online, this is a series that's just started today. So we have a whole host of speakers from around the world that are going to really kind of unpack a lot of what Andy talked about, and we'll hear different speakers covering things like detection, attribution modeling, all that sort of stuff. And our next one, just to plug for the next one, is on March 6th, and we're going to hear from Scott Lowry from iNaturalist. And iNaturalist is a globally popular nature platform with a goal to conserve biodiversity through public education, engagement, data generation, and on-the-ground conservation efforts. Machine learning plays a key role in these efforts as the platform expands. The talk will cover the machine learning models used by iNaturalist and how they are trained and implemented on the platform. I think Maria, Andy, and I are all active users of iNaturalist. We love the platform, and it really is incredible. And something that's being used by just regular folks all around the world to really build a better understanding of biodiversity. So again, thanks, and I'll leave the floor to Maria for any final remarks.
Just thank you very much, Andy, for this great presentation. I think people really loved it. Many comments. Well, no, just if you have examples of these applications in the Global South, please contact us. It has been kind of challenging to find some of them. So, well, thank you, and keep in touch.
Maria. Thank you, everybody. Pleasure.
Thank you for participating in today's AI for Good session. We hope you've learned something new, innovative, and engaging in today's event. We now encourage you to continue the conversation on the live video wall in the neural network. Here you can ask questions, like and comment, share links, complete the poll, connect with interesting profiles, or speak one-on-one using the chat and video function. We invite you to explore the lobby, try the smart matching quiz, visit the virtual exhibits, poster boards, the eShop, and build your personalized AI for Good program. Let's shape the future of AI for Good.
AI is a powerful tool.
This summit can help ensure that artificial intelligence charts a course that benefits humanity and bolsters our shared values.
you.